When I first purchased the quiet piece of land at the edge of town, it felt like the perfect escape. The property had been neglected for years, but it was mine, and I had plans to build a modest home there. At first glance, everything seemed straightforward, until I noticed something odd at the back corner of my land. A small cottage stood there, clearly lived in, with curtains drawn, a garden planted, and even a freshly painted mailbox. Confused, I checked my deed, maps, and boundary lines. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The cottage stood squarely on my property. For a moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood or miscalculated. But after surveying the land, it was undeniable. The structure did not belong to the man who occupied it. That man was my neighbor. He had lived there quietly for over 3 years, keeping to himself, never mentioning a word about ownership or boundaries. At first, I thought it might just be an innocent mistake, perhaps something overlooked. But the longer I looked at that cottage, the more questions piled up. I decided to let it go temporarily while I focused on building my own home. I thought that eventually we would figure it out, like reasonable adults. But I had no idea that this neighbor, who had lived on my land all this time, was preparing to turn the situation upside down in the most outrageous way possible. Because soon, the man who had been living on my property would have the audacity to accuse me of trespassing, claiming my newly built house was sitting on land that belonged to him. And that was only the beginning. Construction on my home moved quickly. I had saved for years, determined to build a place of my own, and I wasn't about to cut corners. The foundation was poured, the walls rose, and for the first time in my life, I felt the satisfaction of creating something permanent. But the peace was short-lived. Just weeks after I settled in, I received a letter shoved under my front door. It was from my neighbor, the very man whose cottage sat entirely on my land. The letter claimed that my house was illegally built on his property and demanded I demolish it immediately. At first, I thought it had to be some sort of sick joke, but no. It was written in firm, almost threatening language. He accused me of encroachment, citing imaginary property lines and vague references to his family's land rights. I laughed at the absurdity of it. The cottage was clearly on my property, not the other way around. Still, I double-checked everything again. County maps, tax records, and legal boundaries. Every single document confirmed what I already knew. My house was entirely on my lot, and his cottage was the intruder. What I didn't know was that he had no intention of backing down. Instead, he escalated. Soon, I saw surveyor flags planted in random spots on my lawn, flags that didn't line up with any real property markers. He began telling neighbors I had stolen land from him, painting himself as a victim. And worst of all, he started threatening legal action. It was surreal. I was the rightful owner. Yet somehow, he was twisting the story so far that people began to question me. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with someone who had lived a lie for so long, he now believed it himself. The situation escalated quickly. My neighbor began walking the property line daily, glaring at my house, muttering loud enough for me to hear. Soon, he started sending letters through an attorney, demands that I vacate the home I had built with my own money, claiming damages and threatening to involve the city. The stress was overwhelming. Friends and family urged me to stand firm, but whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. Some people believed his version of events, while others thought it was just a bizarre feud. I kept collecting evidence, aerial photos, legal surveys, historical maps. I even tracked down the previous owner of the land, who confirmed without hesitation that the cottage had always been on my lot. Yet none of it stopped the neighbor's aggression. One day, I came home to find fresh spray paint on my driveway, illegal structure, scrawled in red across the pavement. Another time, stakes were hammered into my yard with signs declaring it his property. He was trying to intimidate me, to make me doubt myself, to wear me down until I gave up. But I wasn't going to give up. If he wanted a fight, he was going to get one. The turning point came when the neighbor filed a formal complaint with the county, insisting my house violated property lines. Inspectors arrived, walking the boundaries, measuring every inch. I held my breath, knowing the truth, but fearing bureaucracy might somehow betray me. When the results came back, they were crystal clear. My house was 100% on my property. His cottage, however, was the real trespasser, built entirely on land that didn't belong to him. The county ordered him to vacate. For the first time, his smug confidence cracked. He refused, of course, but the order stood. He tried appealing, shouting about heritage rights and long-term occupancy, but none of it held water. Finally, the case went to court. My evidence was airtight, and his claims fell apart under scrutiny. The judge not only ruled in my favor but also declared that his cottage was an unlawful structure, subject to removal. The irony was staggering. He had spent years accusing me of building illegally, when all along it was he who had no right to be there. The decision was final. His time was up. The neighbor didn't take the ruling gracefully. He lashed out, slamming doors, cursing in the street, and even staging protests outside my home. But the law was against him now, and every outburst only dug his hole deeper. The county gave him 30 days to vacate and remove the cottage. He begged for extensions, filed motions, and tried everything to delay the inevitable. But when the deadline came, enforcement arrived. Trucks rolled in, crews prepared, and the demolition began. I watched as the cottage, once neatly painted and stubbornly defended, was reduced to rubble. The man stood there, powerless, forced to face the reality he had denied for so long. His 3 years of squatting, his false claims, his arrogant demands, all of it collapsed with the walls of that little house. It was a surreal moment. Justice had prevailed, but the bitterness lingered. He had turned what could have been a simple conversation into a full-blown war, all because he couldn't admit the truth. After the dust settled, the neighborhood grew quiet again. The land was finally clear, the cottage gone, and the absurd claims put to rest. My home stood untouched, legally mine, just as it had always been. The neighbor moved away not long after, his reputation ruined, his credibility shattered. Those who once questioned me now understood the truth, and many even apologized for doubting. Slowly the gossip faded, replaced by a new respect. For me, the experience was exhausting but eye-opening. Owning property isn't just about land and houses. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to take what's yours. I had faced intimidation, lies, and even the risk of losing my dream home. But in the end, the facts won. The irony still amazes me. A man who lived 3 years on land that wasn't his tried to erase my home, claiming it wasn't mine. And in doing so, he lost everything. Now, when I sit on my porch and look across the cleared land, I don't just see a house. I see a victory. A reminder that truth, no matter how twisted others try to make it, always comes out in the end. The end.